My son handed me a suitcase on Christmas Eve. He never knew I owned the house. The suitcase was sitting beside the Christmas tree when I walked into the living room that evening. It was a small, old black suitcase with a scratched handle and a broken zipper. At first, I thought my son Daniel had bought it for a trip. I smiled and asked, "Where are you going?" Daniel didn't smile back. He simply looked at me and said, "Dad, you're the one who's going." I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh and tell me it was a joke, but he didn't. Behind him stood his wife, Claire, with her arms folded across her chest. The Christmas tree was glowing behind them, soft music was playing, and the dining table was already decorated for Christmas dinner. Everything looked warm and beautiful, but suddenly the room felt colder than anything I had ever experienced. "What do you mean I'm going?" I asked. Daniel looked down at the floor. "Dad, you need to leave tonight." I looked at the suitcase. Then I looked at my son. "Where am I supposed to go?" Claire answered before Daniel could speak. "Anywhere. You're a grown man. You'll figure it out." For a few seconds, nobody said anything. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. I looked around the room and remembered how many Christmases we had spent there together. Daniel had taken his first steps in that house. He had celebrated birthdays there. He had opened his first bicycle on Christmas morning in that very living room. His mother had cooked hundreds of meals in that kitchen before she passed away. And now, my own son was asking me to leave on Christmas Eve. I picked up the suitcase and asked quietly, "Why?" Claire rolled her eyes. "Because we're tired of this arrangement." I looked at Daniel. "What arrangement?" He finally looked at me. "Dad, we need our own space." I almost smiled because the answer made no sense. "Your own space, Daniel, this house has 5 bedrooms. Claire immediately interrupted. "It's not about the bedrooms. It's about privacy. It's about having a life without having to worry about you." Those words hurt more than I expected. I had never thought of myself as a burden to my son. I had worked my entire life so he would never have to worry about money. After his mother died, I worked 2 jobs. I drove an old car. I wore cheap clothes. I stopped taking vacations. Every extra dollar went toward Daniel's future. When he went to college, I paid what I could. When he started his first business, I gave him my savings. When that business failed, I told him it was okay. When he got married, I welcomed Claire as if she were my own daughter. And when they told me they were struggling financially and needed somewhere to stay, I opened the door of my home without hesitation. "Stay as long as you need," I had told them. I never imagined those words would eventually become the reason they thought they had the right to throw me out. Daniel finally said, "Dad, please don't make this harder." I looked at him and asked, "Harder for whom?" He didn't answer. Claire pointed toward the suitcase. "Everything you need is in there, clothes, toiletries, your medicine." Daniel packed it. I looked at my son. "You packed my suitcase," he nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words should have meant something, but at that moment they didn't. I walked over to the suitcase and picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Maybe because it contained more than clothes. Maybe it carried 30 years of memories. I looked at Daniel one last time and said, "Merry Christmas, son." He looked away. "Merry Christmas, Dad." I walked out through the front door. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply walked away. What Daniel didn't know was that the house he had just thrown me out of belonged to me. Not him. Not Claire, me. Every wall, every window, every room, and every inch of land beneath it belonged to me. I had bought that house more than 20 years earlier. I had kept the deed in a safe place and had never bothered to tell Daniel because I never thought it mattered. To me, it was simply the family home. I had never wanted my son to grow up thinking about who owned what. I wanted him to believe that home belonged to all of us. But somewhere along the way, Daniel had confused love with entitlement. He had forgotten the difference between being welcomed somewhere and owning it. That night I checked into a small hotel a few miles away. The room was quiet and almost empty. I placed the suitcase on the bed and opened it. Inside were 6 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, my medication, a shaving kit, and an old framed photograph. It was a picture of Daniel when he was 8 years old. He was standing beside his mother, holding a Christmas present and smiling at the camera. I picked up the photograph and stared at it for a long time. I remembered that Christmas. Daniel had wanted a bicycle, but we couldn't afford the one he wanted. I had worked extra shifts for months and eventually bought it for him. When he saw it on Christmas morning, he jumped into my arms and said, "Dad, you're the best." I wondered what had happened to that little boy. Then I noticed an envelope inside the suitcase. I opened it and found a copy of the property deed. I laughed quietly to myself. It was almost unbelievable. My son had packed my suitcase so I could leave my own house, while accidentally placing proof of ownership inside it. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning was Christmas Day, but I didn't feel like celebrating. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat beside the hotel window. I thought about calling Daniel. I thought about asking him to come to the hotel. I thought about forgiving everything immediately the way I had always done. But something inside me stopped me. I realized that every time Daniel made a mistake, I had protected him from the consequences. When his business failed, I paid his debts. When he needed money, I gave it to him. When he made bad decisions, I cleaned up the mess. Maybe I had helped create the man who thought he could throw his father out of the family home without consequence, so I called my attorney, Robert. "Robert, I need your help." He immediately asked, "What happened?" I told him everything. There was silence on the phone. Then he said, "Are you sure you want to make any decisions while you're hurt?" I looked out the window and answered, "I'm not hurt because they asked me to leave. I'm hurt because my son believed he had the right to do it." Robert understood. I told him I wanted to sell the house. 3 days later, Robert had prepared the paperwork. The house was worth far more than I had originally paid for it. He told me I could make a significant profit. I told him I wasn't interested in the money. "Then why sell it?" he asked. I thought for a moment before answering. "Because I don't want that house to be the place where my family learned how to stop loving each other." Robert didn't say anything. He simply told me he would handle everything. A few days later, I drove past the old house. The Christmas lights were still hanging outside. Daniel's car was parked in the driveway. For a moment, I almost stopped. I wanted to go inside. I wanted to sit at the dining table. I wanted to hear my son's voice. But then I remembered the suitcase sitting beside the Christmas tree. I remembered Claire telling me I was a burden. I kept driving. A week later, Daniel called me. I answered, "Dad, yes. Where are you?" "I'm fine." "Are you coming home?" I paused. "Daniel, that isn't my home anymore." He sounded confused. "Of course it is." I said quietly, "No, you told me to leave." He became silent. Then I told him the house is being sold. He immediately became angry. "What, you can't sell the house?" I asked. "Why not?" he said. "Because it's our home." I replied, "It was my home before it was yours." He became quiet. Then he asked, "What are you talking about?" I told him to meet me at the house. When Daniel opened the door, I could see anger and confusion on his face. Claire was standing behind him. I placed a folder on the table. "Read it." Daniel opened the folder and looked at the document. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then his face changed. "Dad, what is this?" "The deed." He looked at me. "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand. You only need to read the name on the document." He looked again. His face turned pale. "You own the house." "Yes." Claire grabbed the paper from his hand. She read it and looked at me in disbelief. "This can't be true." I said, "It is." Daniel sat down. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I answered. "Because I never thought I had to prove that I was your father by proving that I owned your house." He looked ashamed. "Dad, I didn't know." "I know. I thought it was mine." "I know." He covered his face with his hands. "Why would I think that?" I looked at him sadly. "Because you stopped asking. You stopped appreciating. You started believing that everything I gave you was something you deserved." Claire immediately became defensive. "We paid bills here." I nodded. "Yes, some bills," she said. "We spent money fixing this house." I answered, "And I spent 23 years paying the mortgage." She didn't respond. Daniel finally whispered, "Dad, I'm sorry." I looked at him. "I know you're sorry now." He asked, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means you finally understand what you did." He began to cry. I had seen my son cry when he was a child. I had held him after nightmares. I had held him when his mother died. I had held him when his business failed. But that day, I didn't reach out immediately. I wanted him to understand that forgiveness was not the same thing as pretending nothing had happened. I told him the house was sold. He asked me to reconsider. He promised that things would change. He said he would never treat me that way again. I believed that he was sincere, but I also knew that words were easy when someone was afraid of losing something. So I told him, I'm not selling the house to punish you. I'm selling it because I don't want our relationship to depend on a building. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. Then what do you want? I answered. I want my son back. He didn't understand at first. I continued, I don't want the man who thinks about money, houses, and possessions. I want the boy who used to sit beside me on Christmas morning and tell me I was the best father in the world. Daniel started crying harder. Dad, I'm still that boy. I shook my head. Then prove it. The house was sold 2 months later. Daniel and Claire moved into a small apartment. Their marriage began falling apart soon afterward. I never celebrated their problems. I never wanted my son to suffer. I simply stayed out of their lives and let them deal with the choices they had made. A few months later, Daniel found a new job and began rebuilding his life. He called me more often. At first, our conversations lasted only a few minutes. Then they became longer. Eventually, he started visiting me every Sunday. We talked about ordinary things: football, weather, work, food. Sometimes we didn't talk about the past at all, but slowly something changed. Daniel stopped asking what I could give him. He started asking how I was doing. One evening, almost a year after that Christmas Eve, Daniel came to my new house. He was holding the same old black suitcase. I opened the door and stared at it. What's that? I asked. He smiled. Do you remember this? I laughed. How could I forget? He placed the suitcase on the floor. I brought it back. I invited him inside. He opened it. Inside was the old photograph of him as a child. I found this when I was cleaning my apartment, he said. I thought you should have it. I took the photograph and looked at it. You keep it, I told him. He shook his head. No, it belongs with you. Then he said something I'll never forget. Dad, I finally understand what home means. I looked at him. What does it mean? He smiled through tears. Home isn't the house. It isn't the furniture. It isn't the money. Home is the person who still opens the door when you've given them every reason to close it. I couldn't hold my tears anymore. I hugged my son. For the first time in a long time, I felt that little boy again. The boy who had once held my hand and trusted me completely. People sometimes think revenge means hurting the person who hurt you. They think revenge means making someone regret what they did. But I learned something different. The best revenge isn't destroying someone. It's refusing to let their actions destroy you. I could have spent the rest of my life hating Daniel. I could have reminded him every day that he had thrown his own father out of his home. I could have used the house and the money to humiliate him. But what would that have accomplished? I wouldn't have gotten my years back. I wouldn't have changed what happened. I would only have created another wound. Instead, I walked away. I sold the house. I rebuilt my life. And I gave my son something more valuable than another lecture. I gave him the opportunity to become a better man. Daniel never forgot that Christmas Eve. Every year when Christmas came around, he would bring up the suitcase. Dad, he'd say, I still can't believe I did that. And I would answer, neither can I. Then we'd laugh. A few years later, Daniel had a family of his own. He became the kind of father I always hoped he would become. One Christmas morning, I watched him kneel beside his young daughter as she opened a gift. She jumped into his arms and shouted, Daddy, you're the best. Daniel looked at me over her shoulder. Our eyes met. He smiled. I smiled back. Neither of us needed to say anything. We both remembered. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Daniel came into the kitchen and sat beside me. Dad, he said. I owe you an apology, I smiled. You've already apologized. He shook his head. No, I mean for the way I treated you. I spent years thinking you were giving me things because you had to. I didn't understand that you were giving them because you loved me. I placed my hand on his shoulder. You understand now, he nodded. Yes. Then he asked, do you ever regret selling that house? I thought for a moment. No. Why? I answered, because losing that house gave me my son back. Daniel looked down, trying not to cry. Then he hugged me. I closed my eyes and held him tightly. The house was gone. The Christmas Eve was long gone. The suitcase was nothing more than an old memory. But my son was standing beside me again, and that was worth more than any house I had ever owned. I once believed the greatest revenge would be watching my son realize that the house he thought belonged to him had always belonged to me. But I was wrong. The greatest victory wasn't seeing his face when he discovered the truth. It wasn't selling the house. It wasn't walking away. The greatest victory was watching him grow into the man I always believed he could become. Sometimes life teaches us lessons through the people we love most. Sometimes the person who hurts us is also the person who eventually teaches us the value of forgiveness. And sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't revenge at all. It is choosing peace. It is rebuilding your life. It is refusing to become cruel simply because someone treated you cruelly. And when the person who hurt you finally understands what they did, you don't have to celebrate their pain. You can simply hope they become better. That Christmas Eve, my son handed me a suitcase and told me to disappear. He thought he was removing a burden from his life. He never knew that the house he was standing in belonged to me. But the secret ownership of that house wasn't the most important secret I carried. The real secret was that I still loved my son even when he didn't deserve it. And when he finally understood the value of that love, I realized something that no property deed could ever teach me. A house can be bought, sold, inherited, and lost, but a family is built through respect, forgiveness, and love. The house was gone, but my son had finally come home.